From Software is a master at designing bosses of varying scale, which all represent challenges in different ways. Many of you know some of the most iconic bosses from the Soulsborne series, but what you probably don't know is that same sense of scale was utilized in the Armored Core series before the first game, Demon Souls, even released. The Armored Core series does do fights a little differently while still presenting a worthwhile challenge to players. So my hope in this video is to set expectations on how boss encounters work in the Armored Core series for the new players coming from the Souls games. The first thing we need to do is look back at the history of the Armored Core games. My experience with the games mainly comes from Armored Core 3, 4, 4 Answer, and 5, which I will use as my reference points. So there will probably be some unique encounters I miss from other games, and for that I apologize. Just please don't roast me, OG Ravens. Armored Core bosses can often be broken down into three main categories, which I will classify as small, medium, and large scale bosses. The scale also applies to your Souls bosses, but this is where that formula was refined. Small scale boss encounters are typically encounters where you face off against another enemy mech, and these will typically be 1v1 encounters, but there might sometimes be a time when you employ aid of another mercenary or something, so that way the fight becomes a 2v1, or sometimes you might even fight a 1v2 where you're against two enemy mechs. Either way, the combat here is usually pretty fast paced, with all the mechs boosting around trying to gain a positional advantage. One example of a small scale encounter is from the 4 Answer game, where you defeat a famous mech called White Glint. There is also a dedicated game mode for these 1v1s called the Arena. In Armored Core 3, the Arena would have you work your way through a tournament defeating other NPC enemy mechs to fight for the rank of the top pilot. Medium scale encounters usually involve larger bosses that aren't your typical mech. In these encounters, you usually have to deal with some smaller, insignificant enemies who escort the primary target. One example of a medium scale encounter can be found in Armored Core 5, where you encounter a heavily armored and high firepower train which needs to be destroyed. Finally, the rarest encounter type is the large scale encounters, which are typically where you fight and deal with massive structures as bosses. The perfect example of this is in 4 Answer's Spirit of Motherwill mission. Motherwill is a walking fortress which has several objectives that you need to take out in order to succeed. While locating these objectives, you are usually met with plenty of smaller forces while avoiding constant missile barrages. So essentially this kind of becomes a bit of a bullet hell, and these fights are often quite the spectacle and a lot of fun. While all these fights might be different in scale, they all have one thing in common. You're going to be expected to adjust your build for the encounter. You can just brute force your way through the game using just one build, but it would just be so much easier and wiser to customize your mech to the encounter. And the game encourages you to do that because once you buy a part, it becomes free to kind of swap with anything else you might already have. Lastly, combat in Armored Core is focused around ranged combat. This often includes some form of homing missiles, and the usual way to avoid these missiles is through boost dodging to quickly change directions and throw off the trajectory of those missiles. The important distinction here is there are no iframes in Armored Core, so don't expect to get through missions totally unfazed. If I had to compare the movement in Armored Core, I would kind of compare it to that of Bloodborne. I guess I'm more looking at Armored Core 4 and 4 Answer here because those are a little bit faster paced, but in Bloodborne, you don't really perform a dodge roll, you perform more of a positional shift, and that shift is kind of similar to boost dodging in the Armored Core series. So then what can we expect to see in this reboot of the Armored Core series? First, we know the sense of scale will certainly be there. From the trailer alone, we can see giant structures walking through the desert similar to Motherwill. We also see this giant worm, which is unclear at this time if it's an actual boss enemy or just like a regular enemy. And then finally, for the medium scale encounters, it seems like we will be able to team up with another mercenary to take down this giant tank. And of course, there will be fights where we're fighting against enemy mechs of similar size. When looking at bosses specifically, it looks like melee attacks are becoming more and more prevalent in the Armored Core boss mechanics. In previous versions of Armored Core, you would spend just a lot of your time strafing around, dodging enemy gunfire and missiles, while just trying to get in as many pot shots as you can. Perhaps this is an effort to marry the Armored Core and Souls crowds together, but it seems like bosses might have more telegraphed melee attacks than they have in the past. These melee attacks look like they will have to be avoided either by quickly and strategically boost dodging, or when a boss is winding up, maybe it's like a horizontal attack and you can just fly over it. We can see in this clip where a giant mech reels up to slam the ground. It also looks like infinite flight, which was possible in previous games, especially Armored Core 4 and 4 Answer, will not be as easily attainable, which will make for more grounded combat, which is perfect for melee combat. Now, I know there are likely to be exceptions to this idea of grounded combat. For example, the hover capability of the quad legs, from what I can tell, lets you stay airborne for a much longer time, but you're moving pretty slowly, which will leave you vulnerable to other attacks. So maybe while hovering, you're easily able to dodge melee attacks because you're just floating out of reach of them, but because you're just kind of floating there, ranged attacks are very easy to hit you, so there's kind of a trade-off. And this goes back to that idea of customization. If you know you're fighting a big enemy who focuses on melee attacks, maybe you can take the quad legs to hover at a distance to avoid those dangerous melees, whereas if you need to dodge gunfire, maybe you take some lighter bipedal legs that have a more horizontal boost focused build. To add one final note, melee combat is much more of a focus in this title as a whole. In past games, you could dual wield melee weapons, and that's currently unclear if we can dual wield in this game, but from what we've seen in interviews is you're going to be able to equip a ranged weapon and a melee weapon at the same time and seamlessly transition from range to melee combat. This is a mechanic called Assault Boost, which is an incredibly powerful quick thrust forward, which sounds like it's going to move us at the fastest our mechs have ever moved in an Armored Core game, although outside of this Assault Boost transition, I am assuming that the pace of the game is going to be a little bit slower. The types of melee weapons are still unclear, but there's a confirmed laser sword and lance, the pile bunker which extends a physical spike, there's also a chainsaw, and lastly a close range grenade launcher as seen in this trailer. From Software seems to be trying hard to engage with the Souls community and their love for melee action combat, and I've got to admit, this has me very excited. My favorite game modes to play were in Armored Core 4 custom lobbies where players would only bring mechs with swords so everyone would engage in a melee brawl. In closing, I just want to emphasize the fact that Armored Core is a game focused around ranged combat. While there are mechanics that empower melee combat, it's not the primary focus. The melee combat just functions very, very differently from the Souls games. So if you come in expecting this Armored Core series to play like a Souls game, you're going to have a bad time and your expectations are just going to be shattered. I think we still need to see more information about the mobility that's going to be in Armored Core 6 because it's been described simply as somewhere between the speeds of Armored Core 3 through 5, which is a surprisingly large gap. But that's going to be it from me. Subscribe for more Armored Core content in the near future. And as always, this was Goober Troy saying thanks for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.